We do have a lot of stuff going on. Just I know the conference is coming up, and I know some people from here will be going out to Oklahoma for that, so I can kind of update you on some of that as well. I'm very informal, so if you guys have any questions or comments during the presentation, just feel free to ask me. A little bit about this topic and my background. I was born in Tahlequah, raised in, I usually say Muskogee because no one knows where Warner's at, but it's a really small town just south of Muskogee. Our claim to fame is Connors State College, which is just a small agricultural college. And I went to school over at University of Arkansas, and I got my degree in history and historical interpretation from over there. I started off as a park ranger, just as an intern over at Judge Parker's courtroom there at Fort Smith. So I was a park ranger, got to wear the green gray and the fun hat and all that, but I wasn't sure that that was something that I wanted to do. I really kind of dragged my feet going down there. Once I got there, I just fell kind of in love with this history, and it's funny because when I started off down there, it's also on the Trail of Tears removal route, and I felt like that story wasn't being talked about enough, so that was really my focus there was federal Indian policy as it related to removal of the 5 tribes and the rest of natives across the United States. But I also had to do these programs while I was talking about that. So we have what's called execution anniversaries at Fort Smith, which we would go out there and talk about the men who were executed on that day. So preparing for one of those, I started going through some of the criminal case files. And if you're familiar with, not very familiar with Judge Parker's court, if you've ever heard of the hanging judge or ever watched True Grit, that's what that whole history is based upon, that story is based upon that history. And I'll get into that a little bit here on this PowerPoint. But I was going through some of the criminal case files, and I started running across family names. So I saw that my great-grandfather had taken part in the killing of a deputy United States Marshal. He also had busted out of prison, the Cherokee National Prison, along with some of the stars. I'm also a star descendant, so I directly descend from a man named James Starr Sr., who was a signer of the treaty that caused the removal of Cherokees to the west. So there was all these little different pieces that were at play, and then once I started researching the criminal case files, I just started finding family member. And for any of you that are into genealogy, chances are that you probably have some relatives on one side of those laws pertaining to Indian Territory, and I had a lot that were also Indian police officers and who had been deputized at one point or another as posse men under U.S. Marshals. So it's a really interesting time in our history when you look at after removal, and then especially after the Civil War, that's really when it takes off, and you start hearing about this outlaw's paradise and all of this crime that's being committed in Indian Territory. So that's kind of what sparked my initial passion for this history, and then it just kind of took off from there. I've started speaking a lot now, well, for the past 10, 15 years on outlaws and lawmen of the Cherokee Nation. So that has also led me to be appointed to the board of directors for the U.S. Marshals Museum, which is a $50 million museum that is being built currently on the river there in downtown Fort Smith. And it's also going to have information on tribal light horse. And I don't think it's on this PowerPoint, but I will pull it up. We're also Daniel Horse Chief, who is a Cherokee citizen. If you ever go to Tahlequah, you see the beautiful statues around town of Sequoia, or the stickball players out at the Heritage Center. If you go to NSU, there's the beautiful statue of Sequoia. Daniel Horse Chief is the designer and artist of that. So he was actually chosen to do a light horse monument that's going to be there on the river in Fort Smith. So it's really exciting to be a part of all this, and it's exciting that the U.S. Marshal Service, which it was a national competition to get that museum there, it was really exciting that they chose Fort Smith, and they've been so inclusive of all of the tribes and making sure that we have a part in telling our story there. So this has kind of led me to talk a little bit more about I've really started doing a lot of research on law enforcement that were killed in the line of duty. When you start looking at the history and you start looking at, Pretty Boy Floyd, he's really well known in Oklahoma. He's kind of looked at as more of a Robin Hood type individual. But when you look at some of these criminals, they get romanticized, and people really start to kind of prop them up. And we wouldn't do that today with people who commit these terrible crimes. So one of the things is we felt like the law enforcement were getting overlooked, and all of these stories of the outlaws were the ones that were getting glorified. So that's one of the things that we've also been working on with our Cherokee National Prison back home. There's a lot of information in there on the bank robbers and the people who are busting out of the prison and those that were hung, but you don't really see a lot on the law enforcement. So I've been working with cultural tourism to make sure that we tell the story of those lawmen who died, you know, trying to protect and serve. So this right here is a photograph of Indian police officers. This was actually taken in Fort Gibson, and there was a payment that was going to be dispersed pertaining to the Cherokee outlet. And so they were there guarding this money. I love this photograph. I think it's a great photograph. There's a member of Cherokee Lawmen. I think it's Sequoia Houston is the man that's on the very far left. But I just love this photo, so I usually start off with it. So this is what I've documented so far pertaining to Cherokee Lawmen Frontier Era line of duty deaths. And you might recognize some of those names. Sam Six Killer, who was High Sheriff of the Cherokee Nation. He was killed in 1886. He's probably one of our most well-known lawmen. He was also a deputy marshal out of Judge Parker's court as well. But you might recognize some of the names, maybe even family names, because you know, once we start going back and looking, somehow we're all connected, it always seems. Frank West, who is third from the bottom, he has a pretty interesting story. He actually is shot and killed by Sam Starr, who was the husband of Belle Starr, who was not Cherokee. I always like to make sure people know that because she gets a lot of credit sometimes. She was living in the Cherokee Nation, but she was not a Cherokee. She was marrying all of these Cherokee men. Some of them were dying or getting killed, but in order for her to stay on her land there in the Cherokee Nation, she had to be married to a Cherokee citizen. Or any other. If she was going to be in the Choctaw Nation, it had to be a Choctaw citizen. So anyway, Sam Starr and Frank West get into a shootout, and they actually both kill and shoot each other at a party, and they both are mortally wounded and died. And again, if you guys have any questions throughout any of this.
I kind of have one question. I'm thinking it's in this time frame, but when Ned Christie was finally apprehended, was it Cherokee Marshals or was it United States Marshals?
It was U.S. Marshals that came over, and I think I talked about him. I think people get tired of me talking about Ned Christie. He's my favorite person to talk about. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Ned Christie. If not, I would love to tell you that story. I often go out and speak on him. One of my coworkers, Roy Hamilton, who some of you might have met, he was a descendant of Ned Christie, and he was one of the ones that just kind of, he's how I met him, is I became obsessed with the Ned Christie story while I was a park ranger at Fort Smith, and because the text there didn't tell the full story. It made it seem like, you know, Ned was just running from the lawmen and from these deputy marshals for no reason, and he had a lot of great reasons why he was not going to stand trial in the Fort Smith court. So I'll go into that here in just a little bit, but I love talking about Ned. But this is all during that same time period. So these are just lawmen that were killed in the Cherokee Nation. So if you look at a map of northeastern Oklahoma in our current jurisdiction, these are the ones that were killed there. They say that there were more frontier era lawmen killed in a 50-mile radius of Muskogee than anywhere else throughout the country. So it was a very deadly place for lawmen. What was happening was the federal court in Fort Smith, so we had our own court system set up, our own judicial system. If crimes are committed, Cherokees against Cherokees or against other Indian tribes, we would deal with it there in Indian territory or in the nation. But when it involved a non-Indian, so someone from Arkansas comes over and maybe tries to steal one of my horses and I shoot and kill the guy, I wouldn't stand trial there in my nation. I had to go to the Fort Smith court under Judge Parker and stand trial there. And a lot of people felt that it was unfair because, you know, today we have a jury of men, women, it's racially mixed, all of that. But back then it was just white men that sat on the jury. And so people didn't feel like, Indians didn't feel like that we were going to get a fair trial. So that was one of the main reasons why Ned Christie, who I'll talk about later, did not want to stand trial in Fort Smith. But it was a very dangerous time, and a lot of these you'll see, the federal court was established in 1872 there in Fort Smith. So this is when a lot of those, between 1872 and 1907, these are the ones that are killed just in the Cherokee Nation that we've documented. We know that there are more. These are just the ones that we've documented so far. And I'll go quickly through this. It just kind of goes over how we got to developing our law enforcement. Traditionally, Cherokees, when you committed a crime, you paid the price right then and there, and then they let you go. You're either going to get some lashings, if you steal something, or if any kind of, I think, rape, if you would have one of your ears lopped off, and if you did it a second time, then you would be sent to death. So there were different ways that we were able to identify people who had committed crimes and things like that. But if you're stealing, maybe horse thieving, you see that a lot. There's a lot of lashings that usually occur with that. But then we were done with it. So when we created this prison in Tahlequah in the 1870s, it was the first time that that had been done in history. We had the first penitentiary in Indian Territory to rehabilitate our criminals that had never been done before. But all of this starts in 1797 when a U.S. agent by the name of Benjamin Hawkins, he mentions that it's reported that a council meeting of Cherokees which he attended and stated the tribe was taking steps towards establishing this law enforcement. So this is when we begin to take steps. We're actually in the southeast when we start this. Major Ridge and James Vann. A lot of people might recognize the name of Major Ridge. He was one of the signers of the Treaty of Minnesota, which caused the Trail of Tears, the relinquishment of these Cherokee lands, which at the time of removal, you're looking at about just this area right here. And these are just some of the laws. So in 1808 is when we actually pass an act that appoints regulators, is what we're calling them at this time, to suppress horse stealing, robbery, and to protect citizens. And then after Cherokee removal, so the removal for the Cherokees was in 1838 and 1839. And one of the things that you see us quickly do is reestablish our education system, our government systems, our law enforcement. In 1844 is when the National Council passed a bill that authorized what we were calling a light horse company. And it was composed of a captain, lieutenant, and 24 horsemen. And I always get asked this, so I finally included it. The origin of the term light horse came from Revolutionary War soldier Henry Lee, who was called Light Horse Harry due to his cavalry movements during conflict. And this just gives you an idea. So after removal, we have the Cherokee Nation here, the Choctaw Nation, Creek, Chickasaw, the Seminole Nation. They were one of the most feared of the light horse, actually. They were the smallest, but they were said to be the most efficient. So, and these are all, like, if you have questions about this, because if we were to talk about the history of Civil War, of the treaty, of removal, we would be here all day. So I just kind of go through these very quickly, but Civil War and Reconstruction, what it does in 1866. So we initially sided with the Confederacy. We were kind of forced into that because the Union, the federal government, had abandoned us there in Indian Territory. So we really didn't have any other choice but to side with the Confederacy. We ended up signing a treaty with them. And John Ross did try to keep us neutral. He was the political chief at the time. Stan Wadey, who these guys were enemies, John Ross and Stan Wadey, he was actually advocating for a separate Southern Cherokee Nation at this time. So this is our prison. This is what it looks. This is what it initially looked like on the left. It initially had a third floor. That third floor was taken off because of there were fire codes that were being broken, which really I didn't think I didn't know that they had them back then, but I guess they ended up taking that third floor off, and it's in various buildings throughout Tahlequah that they've used that stone. This is what it looks like today if you were to go there. We do have an interpretive center next door that talks about the history of our tribal law enforcement and then also the individuals who were imprisoned here. The newspapers quote it as built of sandstone rock, made to hold the most hardened and dangerous prisoners. There were so many people that escaped from this prison. I found, this is the one where I found that my great-great-grandfather had escaped here along the same star. And then those two guys later shoot each other and injure each other. So yeah, there was a lot of conflict going on. But yes, it was built in 1875 for the purpose of reformation as well as for punishment of offenders. It was the only penitentiary building in the entire Indian Territory from 1875 to 1901. It housed sentenced or accused prisoners from throughout the territory. One of the things that was interesting about this is it encompassed about 40 acres, and the men who were there, they learned a lot of different trades. There's a blacksmith shop that they, in the back of the new one, you can kind of see it here. But they would try to teach the men these useful trades so that whenever they served their time, they could go out and be productive citizens. Here's a photograph of Samuel Six Killer, which when you go into our prison, our museum, he did a lot of great things, but the one thing that kind of bothers me is that when you go into there, this is really the only one that we're talking about is Samuel Six Killer. He is one of our most high-profile, well-known lawmen, but there were so many more others that I feel like their stories are just being overlooked. So this is one of the things that I talked to cultural tourism about, and we're now working on a wall of honor to discuss the history of all the men who served, and then especially those who were killed. But he is one of the most well-known. He was first captain of the United States Indian Police. He served as a Union soldier during the Civil War. He was appointed High Sheriff of the Cherokee Nation, Warden of the Cherokee National Prison. When you look at what he was responsible of there in Tahlequah with this prison, it's actually pretty, he didn't get paid enough, that's for sure. He was required to secure all the cooks and all of the staff. He did so much. He was working 7 days a week, minimum 12 hours a day, this guy. So he was also a Deputy U.S. Marshal and a Special Agent for the Missouri Pacific Railroad. He was killed on Christmas Eve of 1886. He was off duty in Muskogee, and he was gunned down by outlaws Dick Van and Al Cunningham. And so it was after the death of Sam Six Killer that the United States legislature passed a bill signed by the president that made assault on an Indian police officer a federal crime. Up until that point, it wasn't a federal crime. A little bit about Judge Parker, since he was the federal judge over all of Indian Territory. So the Western District of Arkansas, as I mentioned earlier, any crimes that were committed, non-Indians against an Indian, it went to this court. I take up for Parker a little bit. I didn't like the guy when I first started there. He often gets confused with the judge out of Texas named Roy Bean. A lot of people have the misconception that if you were caught stealing a horse, Judge Parker would just automatically hang you. He was not like that at all. He did not decide the fate of the men, it was the jury that did, and you could only be hung if you were convicted of rape or murder. And he had no other choice but to sentence you to the gallows. He sentenced 160 men, and of those, 79 were hung under Judge Parker. He was actually a big advocate for women's rights. He was the first federal judge to ever put an African-American bailiff or employ an African-American in their court. And he talks about, in one of his final interviews, before he passes away in 1890, I think it's 96 or 98, how it's the federal government and its failure to uphold their end of what they're supposed to be doing with keeping intruders out of Cherokee Nation and all of Indian Territory. He talks about the Indians, for the most part, are peaceable people, and he puts the full blame on the federal government. So, yeah, there's issues that I do have with Parker, but he was definitely a man of his time, but I also feel like he had a lot more forward thinking than a lot of other men during his time. Any questions about him? I get a lot of questions on him usually.
A random side thing, I don't know if you've read this, but I read that that African-American bailiff that he assigned was the basis for the Lone Ranger. And Tano was actually
Bass Reeves. He was Bass Reeves was a marshal. But yeah, he was, a lot of people say he was the basis for the Lone Ranger. So, The author of Bass Reeves' book, his name is Art Burton. He'll be here in, but he's done a lot of research on Bass Reeves, who, if you ever research any of the men out of Parker's Court, Bass Reeves was, he was a Creek freedman. He knew the languages. I think he knew like 6 or 7 different native languages. He, it was even Ned Christie at one point, there's a news article that says Ned Christie had killed the great Bass Reeves, because Bass Reeves was nowhere to be found for like 2 weeks. And here it was about a week later, Bass shows up in Fort Smith, and he had about 10 or 15 men that he had apprehended out in Chickasaw Nation, and he was dragging all of them back. So he was kind of known to disappear for a while. He did a lot of undercover things, is my knowledge. So, but yeah, Bass Reeves, Google him. He's actually a very fascinating guy. Here's a little bit more on Judge Parker. So he was federal judge for 21 years, sentenced to 160 to hang, 79, he was a supporter, Indian rights, African American rights. I always find it interesting, so he's 58 when he passes away, and I think he's like 37 when he first takes office there on the left, and it just shows you how much that court aged him. He technically died of Bright's disease. I don't even know what that is, but the doctor said that he pretty much worked himself to death. So all of this begins to happen in the 1870s, and then the 1880s, they established what's called the Union Agency. You see a lot of this when you start looking at more of the Western tribes. There's a lot of disconnect sometimes between the Indian police and then also the natives who are living on the land. I always explain it as this is just one other avenue that the federal government used to try to divide us. However, I do see some of the reasons why they're doing it as well. Indian police are so complicated in history, no matter what tribe you're looking at, because some people view them as fighting or being on the wrong side when they should be on our side. But when you have federal jurisdiction over your territory, do you want non-Indians coming in to police it, or would you rather have your own people policing it? So there's always kind of that battle between the two. The United States Indian Police, it was headquartered at Muskogee. They can travel throughout the nations of all 5 tribes in pursuit of Indian citizens accused of a crime. Most of these men were also deputized by the as U.S. deputy marshals so that they could pursue and arrest non-Indian citizens. They were paid a salary by the U.S. government that ranged from $5 to $15 a month. And it's just one of the first ones that they had. Frank West, I think it's one of the artifacts we're actually trying to acquire. He was the brother of John C. West, who was the last captain of the U.S. Indian Police. He had previously shot and wounded Sam Starr while arresting him for robbing the mail service. December 17th, they both attended a Christmas dance. Sam Starr approached West, words were exchanged, guns drawn, and they both mortally wounded each other. So the story goes, the family story is that Frank had shot and killed one of Belle Starr's horses, and they were really upset over it because it was her favorite mare. And this is why Sam Starr approached West at the Christmas party, was to give him an earful or I guess attempt to kill him because of the mare. But his gun, the family still has the gun that shot and killed Sam Starr, and it's in their possession. So it's one of those things that we would love to have it in prison as even just on loan as an exhibit. But when you start looking at the history of the West family, they have a pretty long history of dedication of law enforcement in their family. Jesse Sunday, and these are just a few men that I picked out that I'm able to find photos of. This man was the sheriff of the Saline District, half brother of Dave Ridge, who was also killed in the line of duty. He was investigating murder. He was shot in the back and killed by Martin Rowe. So Rowe surrenders himself to authorities 1 month later, was tried, convicted, and originally sentenced to death. It was commuted to 10 years. He escaped 3 months later and joined the Army, and all charges dropped. You see this this is very common to happen during this time. my own grandfather, when I was researching when he escaped, what happened to him afterwards, I think eventually they just gave up pursuing men. And there's a lot of stuff that's going on during this time in the 1880s, 1890s. The federal government starts chipping away at our jurisdiction and what we can do. We're moving towards statehood. So there's a lot of issues that are going on that are complicating things as well. But this man didn't die until 1960, the man that killed Jesse Sunday. So it's just kind of interesting because his family's still around, and there's a lot of Sundays as well. Name's very familiar. Sequoia Houston, Deputy Sheriff of Telephone District. And there's his grave. It's actually just north of Telephone if you're going towards Locust Road. It's kind of on the side of the road, just pretty much abandoned. So we've been trying to get attention to some of these sites and go out and do some restoration. I do a lot of cemetery restoration and preservation workshops. So we just kind of try to go out and talk about how to take care of the headstones and things like that. But he was shot and killed by Cherokee Bill, who's another infamous outlaw. He was sentenced to hang by Judge Parker. His real name was Crawford Goldsby. He played a role in 7 murders along with the Cook Gang. He was Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, and African American. And he's quoted as saying, when he's asked by the paper what he was, he says that he was half Cherokee, half black, half Creek. So, however all that. So while he's in jail, it's pretty interesting. So while he's in jail, he somehow smuggles in a gun, gets a gun smuggled into him. And he ends up shooting and killing one of the jailers. And it was Henry Starr, who was also on the same, he was being sentenced to death as well. They called this row part of the prison, they had called it kind of murderers or death row, where they had kept all those high profile inmates. But since Henry Starr was able to get the gun from Cherokee Bill, they lowered his sentence. And then he ends up getting pardoned by the president. This is the only known photograph, and it's not even a photograph, it's a sketch of the gallows there at Fort Smith, which is shocking because right before Parker gets there in 1872, Parker doesn't get there until 1875, but in 1872 there was a judge there by the name of William Story. These were public executions. Thousands of people would show up, even though there's a fence around Cherokee Bill's execution. There were still, they say, around 3,000 to 5,000 people who attended the execution of his. But Judge Parker, when he got there in 1875, he called it a circus-like atmosphere, and he hated to see it. People would bring picnics, picnic lunch. They would all show up to go watch the hanging on a Sunday afternoon. I can't imagine doing that, but Parker had this fence put up around the gallows, and so after that you had to have a ticket to be able to get in to those gallows, and the only way you could obtain a ticket to get in was to be a member of the press or related to the victim or related to the person that's going to be sentenced to death. So there were only special reasons that you were allowed in for that. So I think it's Hang 'em High when you see it. Anyone's ever watched those movies? Which is funny that I watched that, because when I first started getting interested in all this history, I'm coming home and I'm writing Hang 'em High and True Grit, and my family's looking at me like I'm crazy because I've never been into Westerns before. And I'm like watching all these Western movies, but I think it's Hang 'em High. It shows Judge Parker watching the executions, which numerous people have stated that he never watched a single execution. So when I go to museums, I'm terrible to go to museums with because like I'm constantly picking stuff apart. I'm trying to be better at that. So Zeke Proctor, I hope I talk. I'm trying to remember which slide this is. Yeah. So he's a sheriff. He ends up becoming a sheriff, Cherokee senator, U.S. deputy marshal, which is interesting, given that the events called the Go Extinct Massacre. This is actually going to be the largest part of the U.S. Marshals Museum because it is the largest loss of life in a single incident for the U.S. Marshals Service. I'll tell you the story here in just a second. This is an unknown photograph of Zeke Proctor, so we're not going to share that too much because it's supposed to debut in the museum, but I just recently put it in here. museum will be open this year, so the 1872 Going Snake Massacre is still, we want to do I'm a historical consultant for a Cherokee Almanac for OSIYO TV, and we've been talking about this story and how we're going to do it, but we just know that 3 to 5 minutes a lot of time is just not enough to tell this story. So we kind of want to do it on a larger level. But this is such a complicated story, and it shows how the federal government started overreaching when it came to jurisdictional, the jurisdictional conflict is what it's about there in the Cherokee Nation and Indian Territory. So if you move into the Cherokee Nation and you're married, a white man marries a Cherokee woman, you are subjecting yourself to all laws under the Cherokee Nation government. You were considered a Cherokee at that point. And this is in the 1870s. So what happens is James Kesterson, who was married to Zeke Proctor's sister, James Kesterson completely abandons his wife and children. And Zeke is upset about this. And James Kesterson moves in with this lady named Polly Beck Hildebrand. And she's working at the mill. I think her previous husband had passed, and that was his name was Hildebrand. So Kesterson's living with Polly Beck. Polly Beck is also a Cherokee woman. So Kesterson goes there to confront Kesterson. Did I say that right? Proctor goes to confront Kesterson. A fight ensues. Proctor attempts to shoot and kill James Kesterson, the white guy, and Polly jumps in front of him, and she's the one that was shot and killed. So we have a Cherokee man, Zeke Proctor, who has killed a Cherokee woman, Polly Beck. So where are we going to stand trial? In the Cherokee Nation, right? Well, what Kesterson did was run to Fort Smith, and he filed assault charges on Zeke Proctor for attempting to kill him. So, and witnesses say that it was Kesterson who actually, well, this is where everything gets complicated, and we all love to argue back and forth with the Marshal Service, who pulled the gun first, and things like that. So Zeke Proctor turns himself in immediately, and he's going to stand trial in the Cherokee Nation. So we already know there's going to be trouble. They move it from the Going Snake Courthouse, they move it to an area called the Whitmire School. School is actually dismissed early that day. And the reason why they chose the schoolhouse is because there's only one entrance. One entrance in and out, and it had limited windows. So the trial's going on, and Deputy U.S. Marshals ride up to the trial. Now, they are instructed to not try to apprehend Proctor unless he is found not guilty of the murder charges. And this is where we all start arguing who fired first. So the Cherokee story says that the marshals showed up and just started, guns blazing. The marshal story is that the Cherokees fired on them first. What happens is 11 men end up dying that day during the trial. The judge gets shot. Zeke Proctor's brothers shot. There's attorneys that are killed. And all in all, there's 11 men. Of that, there's 8 Cherokees, but they're not all on what we would say the Cherokee side of things. So the Becks are also involved in this, who are related to Polly Beck. They want to see Zeke Proctor hung for this. They want to see him serve, be sentenced for the killing of their family member. The Becks were the ones who were posse men who came along with the Deputy U.S. Marshals. So a lot of people say that they're the ones who actually ended up doing the killing or the shooting first, but the stories are so conflicting and we'll never know. But the Becks are also Cherokees as well, but they're considered to be on the U.S. Marshal side of things. So anyway, so we have 11 men dead, and the next day the trial actually continues and Zeke Proctor's found not guilty. What's most ironic is that Zeke Proctor ends up becoming a Deputy U.S. Marshal after all of this. So you see a lot of that. You'll see men who even had a previous record or reputation for being outlaws that will also become Deputy U.S. Marshals later on. So these are the men that are all on the Cherokee Nation side. Hopefully I fit the federal government side on here. So on the Cherokee Nation side, we have Zeke Proctor, who's wounded, Moses Alberty, the defense attorney. He's dead at the scene. Johnson Proctor, Zeke's brothers, dead at the scene. Andy Pallone, dead. John Proctor wounded. Judge Six Killers wounded. Isaac Van, Ellis Foreman, and Joe Cheney are all wounded. And on the federal government side, although we also have to remember that these are also Cherokee Trade Fair, and Sam Beck. The Becks mainly, yeah, I think those are the only ones. But this shows you who all is wounded and dead. Now Owens is, I don't know why I don't have it on here. He's just, he's injured. So anyway, and then this, I'm not sure why this one ends up over here. This is the U.S. Marshals Museum, is what it's gonna look like. And as soon as you cross the river, if you're familiar with what it's like going from Oklahoma into Fort Smith, Arkansas, go across a bridge from Mullen, Oklahoma, and this will be sitting on the left side of it. I think I have some additional photographs. And this is supposed to open in September, so I don't know.
Any idea why they chose Fort Smith for the U.S. Marshal?
Yeah, I mean, it was like DC wanted it, LA wanted it, someplace in North Carolina wanted it. They just loved the history of Fort Smith so much, so it just kind of made sense, like where the, you know, there's such a, when you go into Fort Smith, it definitely has that feel, everyone's very proud of their roots there, although it's kind of interesting. We've got like an old bordello as the city visitor center. It's just kind of stuff like that, but you know, the saloon, like there's somebody that's trying to open up like a saloon bar, I think, right now. And you've got the Fort Smith Museum of History, the National Park Service. When you go into that site, there's a lot of information on the Deputy U.S. Marshals and all of that as well. And then I also have some, this is what the Government exhibit's gonna look like. It's supposed to replicate a schoolhouse. And I think it's on this other slide that I have some information on it. I have so many. Different. Because sometimes when I go and talk about this, people don't even have an understanding of Cherokee history at all. So I have to kind of break it down with Cherokee history. This is a photograph of Ned Christie. So when you hear about Ned Christie, he often gets lumped in with Zeke Proctor. There's even a book out there called Zeke and Ned. And it's because these are the two cases that a lot of people will point to when it comes to federal jurisdiction. So the federal government, the marshals should have never been there that day at the Going Snake trial at the Whitmire School because they had no jurisdiction. Kesterson, he runs to Fort Smith. He's trying to file these assault charges. I don't think he was wounded or anything like that. So they were just looking for a reason to be able to come in and arrest Zeke Proctor is what that was about. But it really shows you that's kind of one of the cases where the federal government even acknowledges that they should have never sent Deputy U.S. Marshals over there to that trial or to arrest Zeke Proctor. This is also a great example of how our Cherokees felt about that federal jurisdiction. Ned Christie, who was a Cherokee senator, very well respected. He was part of the Kituwa Society, which was one of our most traditional factions in the Cherokee Nation. He was against the allotments, he was against the railroads, and he thought the federal government needed to stay out of all Cherokee affairs. And so in 1887, he's accused of killing a U.S. Deputy Marshal by the name of Dan Maples. Ned Christie had always professed his innocence. There was actually 5 people who were spotted at the crime scene who, when they first initially send out arrest warrants, there's 5 men that they have arrest warrants for. I always feel like Ned was the one that took the fall because he was the only one that they never apprehended. They brought in the rest of the guys, brought them there, they interviewed them, and they were all eventually let go. They're all pointing fingers at each other. No one's pointing fingers at Ned Christie initially, but in the end, it's when Ned Christie refuses to show up. He actually asked Parker if he'll surrender himself if he'll bring him bail, but Parker refused that. Years eluding the deputy marshals, even though he never left his home. So marshals will come and go, they'll fire up on Ned, Ned starts firing back on them, and he has a lot of people in his community that are looking out for him too. There's what people call forts. It's these rocks that's kind of more of a lookout, and so there was someone that was always there and would let the family know when there were marshals in the area. His house is burned down at one point. He rebuilds it and he makes a double wall cabin. He puts sand in between the walls. There's little portholes that he builds. So yeah, this goes on for almost 5 years. And finally, they end up bringing a cannon from Kansas. They have a lot of dynamite with it. There's about 32 marshals that show up, and this is over a 24-hour standoff that ensues between Ned Christie and his family and the federal marshals. And then they finally do, well, they put so much in the cannon, they actually blew the cannon apart at one point. So they used the dynamite to wheel the carriage that it was on up to the door, and they caught the cabin on fire, was how they were able to get him out, and then they shot and killed him. Let's see what I have. There it is. So this is a photograph I don't ever really like to show unless there's somebody here to talk about it and give some interpretation on it. So the issue with Ned Christie is after they shoot and kill him, they tie him to a cellar door, and they bring him first to Fayetteville and then later to Fort Smith, and they prop him up there on the steps of the federal court there. They place a weapon in his hand, you see the gun, and I mean, there were newspaper articles that ran all over the world at this point. I think it's even in the London Times that Indian outlaw Ned Christie had been apprehended. And my issue with this whole story was when you go to Fort Smith and you look at the panel there, it used to have this photograph and the other one where he's standing there with his, the one on the left. Those are the only two photographs that they had of Ned at the time. And they never told the full story as to why he was against the federal government. He said he would stand trial. He just was not going to stand trial on a white man's court. He said that he would never receive a fair trial, and that was his reasons. He wasn't going to surrender himself to a white man's court when he didn't believe that they had any jurisdiction to be over in his country. He felt that any intruders, because it's an intruder problem that's happening at this time. When you think of Indian territory, when you think of the Cherokee Nation in the late 1800s and the frontier era, a lot of people look at it as an Indian problem sometimes. That's our area, that's our territory. At the time of Oklahoma statehood, they say there was around 8 to 1 non-Indians to Indians living in Indian territory. Over the Chickasaw Nation, it's even higher. They say it's 14 to 1, 14 or 15 to 1. It just shows you the amount of people that are coming into Indian territory trying to get a piece of land. And then there's the land runs that happen. You know, Judge Parker actually tried, he put Payne on trial, who's known as the father of Oklahoma, who was a boomer. He puts him on trial numerous times. And Ned was just fed up with all of this, and he wanted everybody out, and he wanted us to be able to oversee our own jurisdiction. So his reasonings, that's why a lot of people will call him like one of our last true patriots. So when you see photographs or he's on a t-shirt with Ned that says Patriot on it, people love this man in the Cherokee Nation. When you look at books, he's often portrayed as an outlaw. So there's not a lot of people who go further and try to learn the full story on Ned Christie. He was very well respected. He was known for his passionate speeches, talking about how we must never surrender our lands, because you did have Cherokees who were also advocating for the railroads to come in, for allotment to happen, and Ned was against all of that. So it was very disrespectful is how the family felt when he's not allowed to be given, we have certain rituals and ceremonies that we like to perform and do after somebody passes away. You know, within 4 days, you should be buried. There's these traditional ways that Cherokees have, especially people of the Katua Society at that time. So this was the issue. Watt, his father, was finally given permission to come and pick up his body. And I think I have it. So this is from the Fort Smith elevator. All day Sunday, crowds of people visited the jail to view the remains of the dead outlaw. I believe it's also in this same newspaper article that one of the deputy marshals is quoted as saying, they wanted children to see what would happen to you if you decide to go up against the federal government. This is what's going to happen to you. So yeah. Now the superintendent at the Fort Smith National Historic Site, she was hired a few years ago. She's a Cherokee woman, and one of the first things that she did was have this photo taken down. So the family was very happy with that. These are some of the marshals that were involved. Hayden Tolbert, his descendants used to come in all the time, and like they still refer to Ned as an outlaw. So I just kind of steered clear of them every time. But they all went down to the photographer, all had their photographs taken. I think there's even another photograph, yeah. So these are all the men that were involved with apprehending and killing Ned.
See, one guy, I think that's overkill.
Yeah, right.
Do you know, my personal feeling on everything I've read is that he did not kill me.
So there's a 1922, 1918, 1922, I'm trying to remember the date, a man that comes forward and says, his name's Dick Humphrey, he says that he's the one that witnessed what happened, and it was Bud Traynor who had killed Dan Maples. So he was a Cherokee freedman, and you have to think this is Jim Crow era as well. This is why Dan Maples, or Dick Humphrey didn't want to come forward. So there's some people that dispute that story as well. So I don't know. We'll never really know, I don't think, but it's important just to kind of note Ned's issues with the federal government at that time. I can't think if there's anything else. One of the things that always bugged me about Fort Smith, which I love the history there, and I love working at the historic site, but when you walk in, this photograph is on a wall that is the size of this and even, taller. And it makes it look like there's an Indian problem. That was my big issue with Fort Smith, is that you walk in and you see all of these outlaws who are under arrest, or they've just apprehended them, and it doesn't really, I feel like, promote the intruder problem that was going on. So that was always my big issue with the interpretation there. I don't know. The new superintendent, she's really trying to change some of the stuff, which there's that fine line of what draws in visitors. This is what draws visitors in. People want to know about Dalton Gate. They want to know about the Cooks. They want to know about Cherokee Bill, and they want to know about the Stars. That's what, I don't know, it's one of those fine lines of what's going to continue to have visitors coming in, but where do we draw that line with, we got to tell the accurate story too, and try not to promote these men. I have a friend who had a band named the Rufus Buck Gang. The Rufus Buck Gang, there were 6 of them that were killed. When you read what they did, it was terrible. There's a book called 13 Days of Terror. They did some horrendous things to families, to wives in front of the husbands that they had tied up, and they killed numerous people. So I just don't get it, when people try to, but you see it all the time. People will name their band or whatever they're a part of in reference to some maybe famous outlaw. So, and I get it to an extent, I don't know, but it's one of those, we wouldn't prop them up today. You don't want to take one of our worst killers today and name a band after him, or, make his face the focus of everything. So I feel like we do that with a lot of these outlaws at that time, especially even when you start getting into the early, 20th century and the whole gang and the mafia and all that stuff. Like, people love to hear about that stuff. So I don't know. I think it's funny that his kid's here. This happened in Wagner. This is when Cherokee Bill, who's in the center, is apprehended. And the quote that goes along with this is, he got tricked there. There was supposed to be a girl that he had a crush on, that was supposed to meet him there. And that's the reason why he showed up. He knew everybody was after him. And right after this photograph was taken, there was a big scuffle, and he tried to get this deputy marshal's gun. And he quoted telling the newspaper that day that had he got that gun, all of the men there would have went home in wooden overcoats, reading coffins. So, did you see a number of kids here? Any other questions about any of that? Because I could seriously sit here and talk about this stuff all day and like really drive you guys crazy with it, but here's some more. I just got different PowerPoints. Here's another photograph of the district court at Muskogee in 1889. Like I said, I've got different kind of PowerPoints for all of these. I didn't even go into really the stars, who are fascinating as well. This is a photograph of Belle Star. She's actually kind of interesting. Growing up where I grew up, Younger's been. She had been with Cole Younger, and he was a well-known outlaw. When I lived in Warner, everybody I knew was related to Belle Star, everywhere. And so I kind of just grew up thinking, okay, we all roll our eyes at it. But she was marrying Cherokees, and in order to keep her land there at Younger's Bend. Her father-in-law, Tom Starr, was said to not be a very big fan of hers. Jim July Starr was her last husband. She also was married to Sam Starr. After he was shot and killed, she marries his adopted brother, Jim July Starr. And then Henry Starr, he's pretty interesting. There's a book that he wrote while he was in the Colorado State Penitentiary. And he's well known for his bank robberies and train robberies, to the point where he's the one that ends up getting the gun from Cherokee Bill when they're in jail there on Murderer's Row. And he was sentenced twice. He ends up getting pardoned. He's very charismatic. He's so good at what he does that he ends up working for Paramount Pictures, helping them stage bank robberies and train robberies. So he ends up making a movie. It's called A Debtor to the Law. He just couldn't give up. I feel like he just had that sense of, I don't know. He ends up getting shot and killed. After all this, he ends up getting shot and killed in Harrison, Arkansas, while his gang was trying to rob 2 banks at one time. So he just couldn't give the thrill of it all up, I guess. But he wrote a very interesting book. It's a really short read, but you can get your hands on it. And it's called The Life and Adventures, or The Exciting Adventures of Henry Starr. And he talks about how he wasn't always an outlaw, that when he was accused when he was younger of stealing something that he didn't actually do, that he thought, well, if I'm going to get accused of it, I might as well do it. So that's kind of that's what he says, that's what prompted him into his life of crime. But a lot of people will say he was the first person to rob a bank with an automobile. I actually found where there was one that had occurred, I think 5 years before he did. But he was one of the first to rob a bank with an automobile. And at the end of his book, it's a funny quote where he talks about, he's portrayed as this crook, as this bad guy, and really it's the attorneys, it's the lawyers who are all the big crooks, because he's given them all his money and he's still going to jail, and it happens, I don't know, he's really turning everything over to the attorneys. It's kind of funny the way he tries to spin everything. But it's an interesting book if you can ever get your hands on it. Like I said, it's a very short read. I've been trying to locate the movie that he did. It was a silent film, but I haven't so far been able to find any record of it. I think Library of Congress has information on it, but I don't think there's actually any other reel that still exists. So, I don't know. We're going to try to track that down, because I think that would make an interesting story if we could find some of that. And I don't know if I have the movie posters. There's movie posters and everything that exist of it that I probably have in another slide on here.
I can see why Belle Starr would want to keep marrying Cherokee men, keep her alive. But it sounds like of her several husbands, there were multiple stars, is that right?
Yeah, so at first she was married to Jim July Starr, and then, or no, Sam Starr, and then when he shot and killed, she marries his brother, his adopted brother. But that was the only way she could keep her land there. So to live in Indian Territory, you had to either be a citizen of one of the tribal nations, or you had to be married to a citizen of one of the tribal nations, or you had to have a special permit by the federal government to be there. So those were the only ways that you could live in Indian Territory. Everybody else that's coming in and claiming land are illegal. They're known as intruders. So when you apprehend them, a lot of them would get kicked out, but they're just coming right back over into the borders. So
what were Belle Starr's husbands attracted to her for? For her life?
you know, you look at photographs of her, I saw one photograph one time that I had never seen before where she actually looks like a pretty woman. But people always talk about how the photographs don't show it, but she was very well educated, very well cultured. They say she could play the piano beautifully. So I can see the attraction to her, but we don't have any photographs of Sam Starr. I don't know what he looked like. Jim July Starr, we saw that photograph with him, but she just gets this. She was known for hiding out a lot of the outlaws at her home in Yoder's Bend. All these crimes have been attributed to Belle Starr, but she was only ever convicted in court one time, and it was for horse stealing. And she served 1 year in the Detroit prison for that. And that's like all she was ever convicted of. So it's kind of fascinating that after all that, she ends up getting killed. A lot of people don't know. She's shot and killed off her horse by somebody she probably knew. To this day, her murderer is, no one knows who it was. Was it her? Was it a neighbor down the road? A lot of people say it was her son that killed her. Some people say it was one of her lovers, but we don't know. So I did a thing for the Travel Channel on her like 3 years ago, and they wanted a woman to come talk about. They thought she was Cherokee or something, and it was kind of interesting. They had a saddle at the Oklahoma History Center, and she was known for riding side saddle, and it wasn't a side saddle horse. So of course I'm questioning everything. Like I said before, I'm terrible to go to Museum West. So I'm like, I don't really think she would have ridden this. Like, where did you get it? Like, so we ended up doing fine, but I hate that interview because it's just, they kind of feed you the lines on that show trying to get you to say what they want you to say. But she's a fascinating character. I have a whole different level of kind of interest in her now that I never had before. Here's another one of posse members right after they killed Ned. So, I guess I should consolidate some of these onto one.
Was that a picture of Cannon in the background?
I think it was just like a steam something. They called it a steam something. I'm not sure what that thing was. This was something that ran in the New York Times, notorious outlaw shot. And then Christie killed, one companion burned, and another caught. Sad story on this, one of the young men that were there with Ned, who looked at Ned as a father figure, he ends up, his name was Arch Wolf, he ends up renaming himself to Arch Christie. He ends up dying in the whole event traumatizes him. He didn't speak English. He's sent to an asylum somewhere up in South Dakota, North Dakota, somewhere north. And he's buried up there. He's the one that I would like to see us bring home. I don't think he even has a headstone. Roy Hamilton, who worked with me, he was doing a lot of research on him before he passed away a few years ago. So I'd like to kind of continue some of that and see what he had on. Because I have all of his files. It's just Roy was involved in so much stuff that I'm just constantly trying to pick up where he left off in some different things. But it's kind of a sad story that Arch Christie has, because he was very young. And they kept calling him deaf and mute, but they didn't understand that he just didn't speak English. And that, yeah, he was traumatized with some of the events that had just happened. Any other questions on anything? I always encourage people, if you ever come home to Telesaw or, here we go, I have photographs here. talking about outlaws here. Look at me. I'm all like talking about these outlaws. There's another photograph. Parker served time in Colorado Penitentiary. Moves to Hollywood, becomes a film star, helped Paramount Pictures stage their bank and train robberies, couldn't give up his outlaw lifestyle, killed in Harrison, Arkansas in 1921 when his gang was trying to rob a bank. And then this is his movie. Oh, it's the thrilling events, Life of Henry Starr, that he wrote. And then this is the movie that he did. And there's another photograph of him on the right. I'd like to find some original Henry Starr. But yeah, I always tell people, if you come home to Oklahoma, Fort Smith is right across, it's about an hour and a half from Tahlequah. There's some fascinating history in that building. And the new superintendent, she's done a lot to try to make sure that the Indian side, the Cherokee side, the Choctaw side, especially those that are along the border of Arkansas right there, that stories being told correctly. So she's doing a really great job, but there's some fascinating, I mean, it's all because of federal Indian policy why Fort Smith is there. And this historic site, which talks about the removal era, it talks about the Civil War and our involvement with that, and then also the federal court era. So there's some fascinating history there that all pertains to Native Americans in our time there. So I always encourage people to spend at least an afternoon there because there's a lot to see in this place. So it's got a beautiful walking trail. There's a Trail of Tears overlook that's out there. All 5 tribes at some point came through Fort Smith via the water route. So it's pretty interesting. And then the Marshals Museum will be open at the end of September. And then I went in and got a sneak peek at Dan Horse Chief's statue. He's got the man built for the most part and like God built the horse. And it's going to be huge. It's this huge life-size bronze statue that he's building, and it's going to be on this tall base. So it's going to be really neat to see when all of that's finished and completed.
Well, thank you for all that historical perspective. I grew up hearing a lot of those stories, but every time I hear them, I pick up on something new.
Oh yeah, even myself, like when I start researching this stuff, I'm always finding out stuff, and it's amazing what gets taken out of Oklahoma. I was in California and met family members actually who had photographs of their grandparents or great-grandparents who were Indian police officers, and one of them was a marshal as well, so we were able to document him. But there's so much stuff that left Oklahoma during the Depression and during relocation. That's how a lot of people end up out in California as well. And so it's just pretty fascinating to see some of that stuff come back home. So especially during one of the things I'd like to see done during these annual meetings, I used to go to all of them as well, but I travel and do this as well. So we have 24 at-large communities, so it's kind of hard to do all of the annual meetings and then come to all of these as well. It's just, I have an 8-year-old as well. I'm trying to see him every once in a while. But I'd like to see us do some type of scanning or something where people can bring photographs and things like that, so that way we could try to start documenting what all's out there. Because people bring stuff sometimes, and I'm like, man, why didn't we get a picture of that? Or why didn't we set up where we could record a story? There's a man that lives out in Sacramento area. His name's Bob Wisenhunt. He's, I think, almost 100 years old now. He's a World War II veteran. He survived Omaha Beach. He was injured in Battle of the Bulge. He had lost his eye. He met Will Rogers when he was a kid during the dedication of the Pioneer Woman statue out in western Oklahoma. Bob and his family are from Ullaga, which is where Will Rogers' family is from. He has this fascinating life story, and I sit there and talk to him for 2 hours one day, and I'm so upset that I didn't record the whole thing or something, because he has a pretty fascinating life. So it's some of those people that we meet that sometimes they turn into maybe an OSIYO segment for our TV show, but you put people in front of the camera, they're not always keen for that. I don't like doing that either, but I feel like we need to try to record more of these stories that have left Oklahoma. So
I grew up in the Golden State District, and my grandma said, this place has always had outlaws, and some things never change, right?
Oh yeah.
We have a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I really appreciate it. you hang around a little bit, we'll probably have a few more questions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody know, thanks for coming out today, and enjoyed having you. And what's next month? Do we know yet?
Next May, I don't know.
Okay, well, be on the lookout for next month's agenda. So thanks, everyone.